I'd like to invite Dr. Nirmal Frederick. Welcome, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Raj.
Over to you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Good afternoon, friends. I welcome you all to this instruction course on tackling medical emergencies in eye care practice. I'm Dr. Nirmal Frederick, the chief instructor for this course. I have no financial interest, work as in honorary capacity as NABH principal assessor and full-time consultant at Nirmal Sai Hospital, Chennai. So this instruction course is on managing medical emergencies in eye centers. I have with me my co-instructors, Dr. Atik Sheikh, Dr. Sunita Nirmal, Dr. Gagan Dudeja, and Dr. Kumaran Murugesan. Welcome, folks. As you all know, eye centers are under-equipped, unprepared for the surprises, and many of them don't have ambulance for transfer arrangement, and the team strength is inadequate in terms of numbers, experience, expertise, and training. So this instruction course is basically on how to assess patient plan for OP surgery, how to sense and save a sinking patient in OPD, what are the equipments and training required for managing emergencies, how to call a code blue, and should we have an anesthetist during surgeries, and what exactly are the NABH standards with reference to acute care and emergencies in daycare centers, and certain relevant issue with reference to patient management and some interesting case studies. So medical emergencies, as you all know, are rare medical events that may occur in the OPD or OT, since many of our OTs are daycare OTs. If we encounter these events, it requires immediate diagnosis and management to avoid potential consequences. So we should be ready for the life full of surprises and be prepared to save a life. Once you have this medical emergency, first thing you have to learn is to not panic. And we should be prepared to encounter medical emergency because it's part of our patient care at any point of time and any day it can happen. An important benefit learning CPR or this emergency procedures can give you is the ability to save lives. That's what you get out of this. And also you get empowerment and better confidence level in managing your practice. You are helping someone in their need and creating a hero out of you. And that's beyond the call of our duty. And it also saves yourself and your practice. And for the hospitals, having a number of certified BLS staff, we have more confident, trained staff. The survival rate of emergency patients increase. The transfer process takes much less time. Reduce incidence of medical legal challenges and a happy team and happy patients. So this is the overview of this instruction course. Dr. Atik is a consultant ophthalmologist at Fatima Eye Clinic. He'll be talking to us about how to assess a patient plan for OPD surgery. And Dr. Sunita Nirmal is a consultant at Nirmal Sai Hospital. She'll be talking to us about equipments and training required for emergencies and code blue drill. Dr. Gagan Dudeja is a consultant at Narayan Netralaya and also a senior NABH assessor. He'll be talking to us on NABH standards on acute care emergencies. Dr. Kumaran Murugesan is a practicing ophthalmologist at Kumaran Eye Specialty Center. He'll be discussing about certain case studies on how he managed medical emergencies in his center. And last, most of us, after going through a crisis, are really scared about having these kind of emergencies in our practice and how to tackle this and also manage the other stakeholders in our practice. So stay with us for the entire course, and I'll start my topic. The first talk is on how to sense and save a sinking patient in eye centers. Just start with certain scenarios. This 35-year-old lady came for an incision and curettage for chalazion, and she was on preparation for OP procedure, and injection xylocaine test dose was given. This patient reports to the reception. An appointment was scheduled. After registration, she is seated in the waiting hall. The OP got delayed. She's restless after 25 minutes. and keeps saying, I'm not well, have to see the doctor immediately. But the optoms or the reception people have made her wait politely. The third story is on a 50-year-old gentleman waiting in OPD. Is on for a regular follow-up, diabetic patients, and suddenly get agitated, starts verbal abuse, starts sweating profusely and tremors. So what do we do? And 89-year-old male posted for cataract surgery, anxious. The BP has gone to 180, 110. And in spite of all types of local anesthesia given, patient is restless. So back to the first patient again. So once we reach out to her in the OPD, she starts itching and suffocating. She's awake and oriented, but her breathing fast has become fast and she's getting tired, and also developed hoarseness of voice and generalized flushing. These are the vital signs: 124 minutes, that's tachycardia, respiratory rate is increasing, and the saturation has come down, the BP is coming down. So these are the situation that really triggers a panic in our mind. And the hints to the diagnosis or how to go forward is the acute onset, secondary to a trigger, particularly the injection xylocaine test dose. Patient has a sense of impending doom and hoarseness of voice. So this is anaphylaxis, and you can see that patients suddenly from a good situation, she is turning into bad patients. Anaphylaxis is an acute, potentially fatal multi-organ system reaction, and this is a classic form of anaphylactic reaction. So how do we investigate? Anaphylaxis is a clinical diagnosis, and investigations are not helpful in the acute setting. And we have to recognize it as soon as possible, and you have to ask for history of recent anaphylaxis. And once a sudden onset of signs and symptoms happen, within minutes, you have to initiate treatment and the management part. It affects more than one system, and you also have to know that local anesthesia test or allergy can occur due to the drug or to the preservative, and can happen with any type of local anesthesia. So initial steps in the management of anaphylaxis has to focus on this ABC, airway, breathing, and circulation. And we have to immediately assess the airway. That's a key initial intervention, and start on medications like adrenaline, hydrocortisone, and antihistaminics. And also have to support the patient with oxygen, cardiac monitoring, IV access has to be done, and patient has to be positioned comfortably. And another team has to arrange for transfer an ambulance, or if you have a nearby center or within your center, you have to transfer the patient to safer confines. So coming back to our second patient, presenting with classical symptoms of cardiac arrest: chest discomfort, sweating, upper body discomfort, nausea, shortness of breath, and light-handedness. And our trained emergency staff calls for a code blue, recognizing based on their training and also how to knowledge about how to activate code blue situation. And code blue is activated. Patient is by the time non-responsive, no breathing or no neck pulses. CPR initiated, and then patient is transferred to nearby hospital, admitted in the ICU. Code blue, as you all know, is meant for emergencies in medical field, particularly cardiac arrest. And the third patient, again, as I said, in a busy Saturday OPD, started on with verbal abuse, and the staff were really taken back with the verbal abuse, and suddenly patient started sweating profusely and with tremors, and suddenly falls to the ground with hands on her head and sweating. And these are the classical signs. So we have to know whether is it an emergency. So we see the vitals and check the blood sugar. The sugar was 62 milligrams. And so what do we do? So started treatment for hypoglycemia, gave oral sugar, as well as started with IV dextrose as well as oral dextrose. Patient got stabilized. And the fourth patient, just before the surgery, was very anxious with a high blood pressure. And luckily, we had our anesthesiologist nearby. So we checked the monitor. He gave IV midazolam, sedated the patient. Patient settled immediately. Blood pressure came to 130/90, and he was monitored under the anesthesia care. With vigilant monitoring and early diagnosis, we were able to perform the procedure and he went happily. So medical emergencies can happen anytime, any day, in any center. So debriefing, how are our patients now? The first patient is doing well, did well, admitted in the ICU, recovered in 6 hours. This was the monitor signs after 6 hours, and patient was sent home, and great job. The second patient who suffered a cardiac event recovered in the ICU, treated medically, and then with lifestyle modification, she is recovered well. The third patient who was on hypoglycemia went on to have the procedure and was a happy patient and gave a lot of good reviews about our hospitals. And these kind of emergency situation in daycare centers can happen. So particularly common are these hypoglycemia, anaphylaxis, particularly when you are doing FFA or giving local test dose, asthma exacerbation, seizure, impaired consciousness, and cardiac arrest. So there are many ways of being sick and defining critical illness. So how to prepare our center and our staff. So in the reception and waiting hall, you need to train our staff, and you need to have intelligent reception people. They have to inquire with patients who are reporting sick, check the vitals, and if it's always better to have a trained nursing staff in the OPD to check the vitals and blood pressure, heart rate, and respiratory rate. Having a CCTV really helps, particularly the third patient who had hypoglycemia. So we saw the patient really disturbed and then went to the OPD and saw that her sugar was low, and immediately we were able to resuscitate her. And very important, we train the staff and also have equipments, particularly cardiac monitors, SpO2 monitors, particularly during COVID season is important that we have a SpO2 pulse oximeter and good monitor, as well as blood glucose monitor. It's very important all of them who report with such signs are monitored for the vital signs. So from history, you have to look for red flags, immediate assessment of the patient, and intervene with whatever essential medicines as well as monitors you have. Then diagnose the condition, reassess as frequently as possible, communicate to the patient, communicate to the team, communicate to the ICU or nearby hospital. And also important that you know your patients, particularly elderly patients who have a different kind of response. And you should also have a gut feeling that some patient, someone who is really disturbing you, being unwell or deteriorating, and also have to take inputs from the attenders or the family. And keep an eye on high-risk patient groups, particularly vulnerable elderly patients, multiple comorbidities, patient on wheelchair or stretcher-bound patients, and patients referred from other clinics or hospital. You need to have a high-risk sensitization in your mind. So during the non-emergency phase, in the emergency phase, you have to activate Code Blue or other emergency measures and deploy all your communication skills, reporting mechanism, and involve the team in managing the crisis. And post-deployment, post-emergency phase, you have to develop the standard operating, review the standard operating procedures, retrain your staff, debrief your staff, and keep them ready for another set of emergency exercises. These are some of the reviews we get, particularly patients who had some issues in the hospital, then recovered, and they go on to give good reviews about patients. So it is recoverable. Any emergency stage we can recover, and nothing can replace the skills, knowledge, and abilities and teamwork. So to summarize, the care starts at the doorstep. Vitals are important, vital. Know your patients, particularly review and vulnerable patients. Equip and train the staff, and knowledge, skill, and teamwork will really help us to manage any crisis in the hospital. Problems are not stop signs, they are guidelines, and we should ensure that we take this as a lesson and install proper mechanism to develop emergency care system in our hospitals. Thank you so much for your kind attention. Right. So after this, it's my privilege and pleasure to invite Dr. Atiq Sheikh. he'll be talking to us about assessment of eye surgery patients. So you know, most of our centers are daycare centers, and most of our patients are vulnerable patients with so many comorbid conditions. So it's important that, and they stay with us for a very short time. So they are discharged in the evening or as soon as possible after the surgery, and they have to be cared for by their household people or family or relatives. So it's very important that we assess these patients, plan for their surgery, help them post-operatively, and also communicate properly during the discharge process. So we not only should take care of the ophthalmic part, but also take care of the general part. So it's very important that we assess these patients properly. So over to you, Atik.
My screen is visible, sir. Can I start?
Yes, Atik, your screen is visible. You are audible.
I'd like to thank AOS and Nirmal sir for this wonderful opportunity to talk on how to assess a patient, plan for OP or daycare surgery. So the goals for pre-surgery evaluation mainly involves creating a rapport with the patient and their families, and to ensure that their anxiety level is less, and to reduce the morbidity of surgery, to avoid surgical delays and case cancellation, and to ensure that the patient is optimal at his prime medical condition is best for doing and going ahead with the surgery. Of course, last but not the least, we have to safeguard us and ensure that we are safe. So who is fit for daycare surgery? Well, this was an article which I went through the Indian Journal of Anesthesiology 2007. They say that a patient can be considered as healthy who comes under the clause 1 and 2 by the ASA guidelines. So what is this ASA guidelines? This involves a normal healthy patient as well as a patient with mild systemic disease. These two are patients who can be comfortably taken up for daycare surgery. Age is not a considering factor. We should not consider age as an absolute guideline for considering a patient to be perfectly fit. However, a patient more than 80 years of age can be considered with increased perioperative risk of developing complication. And of course, body mass index is something that is very important that needs to be considered. A patient in general with a body mass index of less than 40 kg per m square can be considered as medically fit as long as his other comorbid conditions are well under control. Patients with BMI of more than 50 are generally considered at higher risk of developing complications. Those between 40 to 50 are in a relative gray area. They should be taken with a case-to-case basis. Perioperative assessment involves a detailed history from the patient, doing a proper general examination other than ocular, systemic examination of specific systems if needed, laboratory investigations, which is important, expert opinion from specialists if needed, a proper anesthetist and a surgical consent is mandatory. With regards to COVID, which all of us are interested on in today's world, this is a guideline again given by the American Society of Anesthesiologists, published in December 2020. Any patient who's had mild COVID with no respiratory symptoms and who has recovered well, they can be taken up 4 weeks later for an elective surgery, 6 weeks for a patient who's been symptomatic, that is mild symptoms, and who has recovered at homes. 8 to 10 weeks for a patient who's been symptomatic and he's having other comorbid conditions like diabetes or immunocompromised patient, or a patient who's been hospitalized. Any patient who's recovered in the ICU and was sick will need a time gap of about 12 weeks. Well, why all this 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, and 12 weeks? This is mainly taken into consideration that majority of COVID patients can develop thromboembolic complications. And this waiting time is mainly to ensure that risk factor window is crossed and we can do the surgery comfortably for the patient. This is to safeguard the patient as well as to ensure that we don't encounter these things. Like for example, after a simple cataract surgery, the patient may go home and the next day if they develop maybe a stroke or an MI, they will immediately blame it on the cataract surgery. If we do it within this window period and medico-legally also, we may be in trouble. So this has to be taken into consideration so that medico-legally as well as ethically, we are right as far as the patient is concerned. With regards to history, a detailed history needs to be taken explaining the current symptoms, if there are any. History of comorbid conditions, mainly the common ones which we encounter include diabetes, systemic hypertension, lung disorders, seizure diseases, cardiovascular diseases, and thyroid disorders. Effort tolerance is a common name or is a common fancy term that is used by anesthetists in today's world. This is a simple term which means that a patient is able to do his routine day-to-day activities, maybe climb a flight of stairs and is comfortable. Previous hospitalization and surgery history also needs to be taken. History of allergies, as Nirmal sir wonderfully told in the previous talk. Medication history again is of prime importance when considering daycare surgeries. What we commonly come across include blood thinners, inhalers, steroid usage, and anxiolytic. That is mainly patients with ischemic heart diseases, lung diseases, or patients on chronic steroids and patients on anxiolytics. These are common drugs which most of our patients are on. When to stop or to restart blood thinners is $1 million question. In general, warfarin, it's better to stop 5 days prior to surgery. We have seen in many places where warfarin is stopped for a day or two, it really doesn't make sense. If warfarin has to be stopped, it has to be stopped at 5 days prior to surgery. With regards to antiplatelets, mainly aspirin, if the patient has a high cardiovascular risk, it's ideal to stop. It is ideal to stop. If a low cardiovascular risk, it is better to stop. If the patient has high cardiovascular risk, we can continue with the drug. If the patient is on clopidogrel, again like warfarin, it has to be stopped 5 days prior to surgery. Well, most of us do clear corneal surgeries. When it comes to cataract, we may say there is no need to stop. But then if block is given or if we encounter an expulsive, we may get into trouble. So it's always better to get a physician to analyze our patient and then take a call with regards to blood thinners. With regards to restarting, if the patient has a high risk of bleeding, it's better to restart within 2 to 3 days after the procedure is over. General examination, assess the patient as a whole. Check the general condition of the patient, check the consciousness level, orientation, hydration, and pickle, which we are fond of. Tyler, icterus, cyanosis, clubbing, pedal edema is very important. Systemic examination, a proper CBS examination by a trained physician to check for heart sounds, murmurs, if there are any, respiratory system analysis, checking the breath sounds, if there are any added sounds, again needs to be evaluated. Abdominal examination, including genital examination, needs to be done, and a proper thorough CNS examination also. Lab investigations, mandatory examination includes maybe a hemoglobin, total differential count, blood sugar examination, serum creatinine and urea, because most of us give NSAIDs post-cataract surgery, ECG to assess the general condition of the heart, chest X-ray today as a routine we do for most of our patients because this gives an idea about the patient's well-being in this COVID scenario. As Nirmal sir said, checking the SpO2 again is of prime importance in today's world. Echo can be done for patients who are at risk. If we are anticipating blood loss like cases, orbital surgeries or DCRs, coagulation profile also needs to be done. Serology again is mandatory considering the safety of our team and us. So how expensive are these tests? Well, a baseline tests, what we discussed previously, will hardly cost the patient around 1,300 to 1,500 with a nominal profit margin. If we don't want that profit, we will be hardly making the patient spend around 900 to 1,000 rupees, which I feel is personally worth it considering our peace of mind. Expert opinion, if needed, has to be taken from cardiologists, pulmonologists, endocrinologists, or anesthesiologists if needed. Consent, again, in today's world, separate consent has to be taken for anesthetist as well as the surgery. One consent form having both is not appreciated in today's world. Both has to be separate. Well, this is something which we follow in our center, a preoperative checklist seen by the physician with a quick tick marks for them so that it is easy for them. We get a physician clearance prior to any daycare surgical procedure that we do. Getting a physician to assess our patient and to give clearance is very, very important in today's world. There is a myth or a fear that we may lose the patient in case we suggest the patient to take a physician opinion. This can be comfortably overcome by counseling our patients, maybe spending that extra 1 or 2 minutes with us and maybe extra 3 to 4 minutes with our counselor. This will save hours and lakhs of rupees that we may have to waste post-surgery in case we get into a grave situation. It is always better to do what we know best. It is advisable to be a king in ophthalmology and live life king size rather than to become a jack in anesthesiology also and be a laughing stock in case we have an issue. So let's stick to what we know best. Physician and anesthetists are our saviors and our patient saviors. It is a myth that they cancel cases. They don't do it intentionally. They do it if need be. So again, I would like to thank AOS, Partha sir and Nirmal sir for this wonderful opportunity. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Atik. Thanks for that wonderful talk. Right.
So I think I have a question.
Talk. Yes, Kamran.
Yes. So how early do we have to get a physician fitness for a surgery? So, say in case we are operating a case the next day morning, can we get a physician fitness the previous day night? Is it enough? Or can we get it just immediately before the surgery?
We do it at least a day prior, sir, because on the day of surgery we do and the physician cancels the case, the patient also gets worked up. And in case we start on preoperative drops or anything, the patient uses the drops and then comes back to us and is disappointed saying, I already used this drops for 3 days. Why don't you consider me? So we always make it a point that the physician sees the patient at least 1 or 2 days prior, sir. Not on the day of surgery, sir.
Okay. And what is the protocol for emergency surgeries? So we can't wait a day before, isn't it? So how do we go about for physician fitness in emergency?
So I didn't get your question, sir.
So, no, during emergency surgery, say you have a retinal detachment and you have to take them for surgery immediately. So in those cases, we can just get an anesthetist fitness an hour before the surgery and go ahead, right?
Yes, sir. At least with the CBG and ECG and the anesthetist to handle the patient, and then at least a BP exam, BP check, at least an SpO2, and the anesthetist can see and give a clearance, sir, for emergency surgeries.
Okay.
That's what we follow, sir.
Good. Thank you.
So thank you, Atik, for the wonderful talk. We'll move on to the next talk. It's going to be on the equipment needed for CPR, cardiopulmonary resuscitation, and how to call a code blue. So Dr. Sunita Nirmal, she's a consultant with Nirmal's Eye Hospital. She'll be taking this talk.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, make it slideshow.
Yeah. Is it seen? Can I start?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am. Loud and clear.
Okay. I would like, I'm getting a error message over here. Zoom quit unexpectedly. I don't know what this is.
No, we are able to see you. Please carry on.
Okay. So I would like to thank AOS and Dr. Nirmal for this opportunity. So my topic for the day is equipment and training required for emergencies and CPR. In case of an emergency, the roles and activities of the doctor and the team members should be planned, documented, and displayed. The staff members should be trained and updated in first aid, cardiopulmonary resuscitation, and other emergency procedures. The best office emergency kit is the one that is prepared and maintained by the doctors based on his or her needs and easily accessible at the time of news when it's needed. The knowledge of management of medical emergency definitely increases the confidence of the eye surgeons in their clinical practice. So how do we go about this? First, create an infrastructure for provision of emergency care to your patients in terms of equipment and trained manpower. Gather information about the latest
Your
guidelines.
slide is not moving.
I am in that how to go about it slide. Can you see that?
No. So it's not moving.
Now?
No.
Now?
You stop sharing and then reshare.
Okay. I'm getting this. I think I'll go out of the meeting and come back because it's
Okay.
Yeah, can you see it now? Now? Is it seen?
Not yet.
This one?
No,
No,
ma'am,
you are
not seeing.
not yet seen.
See, I've been getting this error message from the beginning. I don't know what to do.
Raj, can you help her?
Can you see now?
No, we are able to see you, but not the slides.
I just go out and come. I think I'll.
You rejoin,
Yeah.
and then so we'll
Yeah,
finish
leave
Gagan's
that.
talk and then you can present. Yeah, till she rejoins. Since the other speaker, Dr. Gagan, is unable to join us, so I'll take his topic also. Dr. Gagan's talk is about NABH standards on emergency care.
Are you talking now, Nirmal?
Yeah.
You're going to do it now? Okay, fine.
Oops. Are you ready with your slides? Are you able to share? If you
Yeah, I'll try. Can you see now?
yes. Yeah, it's moving now. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Now?
Yes, yes.
Yes, ma'am, it's moving.
So how do we go about this? So first, create an infrastructure for provision of emergency care to your patients in terms of equipment and trained manpower. Gather the information about the latest guidelines about CPR. Document the code blue protocol in your clinic with everyone's role detailed. And practice the way your clinic is going to deal with the immediate delivery of basic life support. And if needed, transfer of the patient to a higher center. So CPR is cardiopulmonary resuscitation, which should be performed immediately on any person who's been found to become unconscious and found to have no pulse. So it is an effort to manually preserve the intact brain function until further measures are taken to restore spontaneous blood circulation and breathing in a person who is in cardiac arrest. So I will just go through the key BLS components in adults. So in an unresponsive patient with no breathing or no normal breathing, and with no pulse palpated within 10 seconds, start the CPR sequence of CAB, that is chest compressions, airway, and breathing. The compression rate is should be at least 100 per minute, and the compression depth of at least 2 inches with a complete chest wall recoil. The airway is cleared by the head tilt and chin lift. The compression and ventilation ratio is 30:2, that is 30 compressions to 2 breaths. Finally, defibrillation, once the AED is available, defibrillation can be done. And if done, there should be the interruptions between the chest compression should be minimal. So defibrillation is indicated in only certain types of cardiac arrhythmias, like ventricular fibrillation and pulseless ventricular tachycardia. If the heart is completely stopped as an asystole or pulseless electrical activity, defibrillation is not indicated. So this is how the AED, the automated external defibrillator, looks like. And this is when it's put into, you just stick up the pads there. And the AED automatically reads and analyzes the rhythm and then prompts if shocking is needed. So if it says that it's needed, then it can be activated. This is the manual defibrillator, which we are all very familiar with in our theaters. So this uses paddles, and here we have to analyze the rhythm and decide whether the patient can be shocked or not. So the masks used in CPR, this is the commonly used pocket mask or CPR mask. So it has a one-way protection valve so that it allows the air to pass from the rescuer to the patient without any physical contact between two. But in the COVID scenario, I don't think this will be used anymore. So we'll have to go into use the bag valve mask resuscitator. That is basically the ambu bag. So that will prevent direct contact with the patient. It is a handheld device commonly used to provide positive pressure ventilation to patients who are not breathing or not breathing adequately. So coming to the oxygen delivery system. So the commonly used is the B-type oxygen cylinder that should be kept ready with on the trolley, cylinder trolley. There's a solid cylinder key should be ready. It's attached to the pressure gauge with the pressure, which has the pressure reducing valve attached to the flow meter. The outlet goes to the oxygen tube, which is connected either to a oxygen nasal cannula or a simple oxygen mask. These are used when the need for oxygen is less. Supposing the need for oxygen is very high, then we use the Venturi mask. Coming to the crash cart, which is basically a multi-drawer wheeled cabinet with all the essential medications and tools that are required in the emergency situations. So this is used, the crash cart comes in use in all these conditions. So on top of the trolley will be the defibrillator with a monitor, a portable suction apparatus, the BP apparatus, stethoscope, the pulse oximeter, and the glucometer. And should be attached on the side is the oxygen supply. The drawer contains, this is just a general guidelines. The first drawer should have the medications, the emergency medications. Second, all the equipment you need for the breathing and airway. Drawer 3 will be the intravenous supplies. Drawer 4, the intravenous solutions and tubings. Drawer 5 will be for the cardiac or chest procedures, and the drawer 6 will be the special procedure trays. So this will how the medication tray will look like. So you should make a list of medications that will be needed for you. This is the general guideline. This covers all the conditions that we commonly encounter in our OP and hospital scenario. So this an idea of what all we should put into our crash cart. This is the pediatric resuscitation kit. So basically, you have to create your own crash cart in any way you want, and everything has to be properly labeled on the outside. Make a list of the drugs that are put up in the medication tray. And as soon as every time it's used, this has to be replenished. So you should have a protocol for that. This is so you also have a crash box, which contains all the things which are there in the crash cart. But this is obviously portable and can be used in emergencies outside the clinic scenario. And in small clinics, this will be more useful. So coming to CPR training. So you have to decide whether you're going to learn and teach yourselves, or you're going to seek external agencies' help in the training. And we need to know who takes the BLS and who needs the ACLS. Basically, the basic life support training is intended for anyone who needs to know the basic principles of CPR and AED usage. Now it is being even taught in schools and colleges and all institutions. Basically, everybody needs to know this BLS. Advanced cardiac life support is designed specifically for the healthcare professionals. So even if you have a crash cart ready, unless you have somebody trained in ACLS, they will not have enough people to handle the medications. So you have to make laminated copies of the necessary algorithms of the BLS and put them up in the hospital or clinic. You have to get a BLS mannequin if you're planning to get the training done at your centers. So you have to make a code blue protocol and train accordingly. So here the first nurse will be anybody who knows BLS. The second nurse should be somebody who has training, who will be a nurse. So this is the ACLS protocol. So these are the must CPR skills. You should be able to diagnose the arrest, raise an alarm, give effective chest compression, clear the airway, and effectively ventilate, and also learn to use the AED. So to conclude, acquire the knowledge, develop an attitude to act in time, practice until the skills become automatic, retain skills by mock drills, and develop and retain good relationship with the police, ambulance, fire services, local hospitals, anesthesiologists, and your own staff. So these are the other conditions which Dr. Nirmal already mentioned. So the training should be not only for the code blue, but also for the other emergencies. And all the drugs that you start in your crash card should include for this. So this is about hypersensitivity to fluorescent dye. So depending on what kind of symptoms you're coming across, we just stop those medicines and treat accordingly. So when you prepare for an emergency, the emergency ceases to exist and you have a very satisfactory outcome. Thank you.
Madam, I have a question. Can I ask?
Yeah, sure.
Madam, with regards to CPR and code blue training, how often do you do it, madam? Like maybe once a year or twice a year? How often do you do it? Or what protocol you follow in your center, madam?
See, anytime we have new staff. Can you hear me, I think? Yeah. So yes, when we have the induction training, no, when you have new staff coming in. So when we have the induction training, we also include this. So it will be like once in 3 months or so. It's not a very specific protocol as it is. Basically, anytime we have like 2-3 staff coming in, so then the entire staff, all of them get the training. So it's like, this is not a one-time thing. No, what you learn, BLS is not a one-time thing. So the memory has to be refreshed each time. So anytime new people come in, the entire staff gets trained by the people who are already trained in it. So the people who come from outside and training, that will be done only about once a year. But this kind of local training happens about once in 3 months or so. Not a specific thing that we're doing it only thing, but we just make sure that anybody who comes in gets trained.
With regards to using an AED or a defibrillator, who can use it, madam? Like only doctors should use it?
No, AED anybody can use, I think, because that checks the rhythm and tells you. See, people can't differentiate whether it is VF or VT. People can't differentiate. So the AED itself assesses that it runs the rhythm and tells you whether the patient can be shocked or not. So you just have to press shock. So that way anybody can use an AED. But you obviously have to be able to read the ECG if you have to use the manual defibrillator. So doctors and healthcare professionals, nurses, trained nurses can use the manual one. AED anybody can use. So that's the advantage.
Thank you. Thank you, madam.
Right. Thank you. Since Dr. Gagan is held up elsewhere in another hall, so I'll be taking his topic on NABH standards for acute care and emergencies. Is my slide visible?
Yes, sir.
Okay. My slide changing?
Yes.
Yes, sir. It's changing.
So this talk is about NABH standards for emergency care. As you all know, NABH has prescribed standards for every aspect of medical care, and it is divided into 10 chapters. So the first chapter is on access, assessment, and continuity of care. So this is how it is modeled. The chapter have standards, and the standards have objective elements. And with reference to emergency, so the healthcare organization, or the eye care organization, has to define the healthcare services that it can provide. So that includes emergency services. And for emergency services, the organization need to have certain procedures applicable as per the laws and regulations, and also has to have documented registration process. I'll just take you one by one. The organization defines and displays the services that it can provide. For example, in eye care organization, if you are providing only eye emergency services, so you have to display that in your hospital or patient care areas. The important thing is that should be in consonance with the needs of the community. So we can define and display based on the language of the region. So it can be told in the brochure also. Ideal is to have a big display sign that you cater for ophthalmic emergency. But as per Indian National Medical Council, National Medical Commission law, every doctor has a liability to treat emergency patients. The second standard focus on well-defined registration and admission process, and that should be there not only for OPD or IPD patients, but also emergency patients. So there has to be documented policies and procedure for emergency patient also, and this should address all type of emergency. So this should address the check-in process or the registration process, the immediate assessment of emergency patients, the management part, the treatment includes resuscitation and then treatment, and also includes transfer out process and the outcomes. The third standard focus on mechanism of transfer. So many of our eye care organization may not have the infrastructure as well as the team to cater for treating the emergency patients. So we have to refer them or transfer them out of our organization. So we need to have certain standard operating procedures and policies for transfer out of these unstable patients. So who are these patients? So that has to be defined properly. These patients are patients whom we can't handle. They have non-ophthalmic emergencies. So we also should identify the staff who can accompany the patient during transfer and referral. And we also need to give a summary of what went through in our hospital, the patient conditions at transfer, and the treatment given here. Overall view of these standards includes the initial assessment and what all initial assessment we did in our hospital. And this has to be standardized, and it need not be same for all visits. Only for emergency care it has to be given, and it should also include nursing assessment, what our nursing staff did to the patients. The fourth one is about the time frame. So as you all know, emergency patients changes over initially from presentation to the other the crisis situation within a time frame. So you have to assess them as soon as possible, and also as per the need, we have to define the timing needed for emergency care. The history, progress notes, investigation, and the treatment order, everything has to be given to the patient. The last part of the AAC is patient care is continuous and multidisciplinary in nature. So even though we are ophthalmologists, we should also have certain qualified individual to as responsible for the patient care. We have to coordinate with the other treatment units in the other centers and the referral units. So the entire care process has to be coordinated within the organization as well as outside the organization. The last one, the information about the patient care and response to the emergency treatment has to be shared between the other team, the medical team, nursing team, other care providers. And this has to happen seamlessly between the shift as well as after the transfer. And transfer has to be done in a safe manner. So one of our staff has to accompany them to the till the patient is stabilized, and it's always better the entire process is streamlined properly, because that decides the satisfaction from the patient's point of view. Chapter 2 decides about the uniform care of patients in all settings, and it is guided by the applicable laws and regulations. And the care delivery has to be uniform when similar care is provided in more than one setting. Particularly the emergency care has to be uniform. And it has to be based on the applicable laws and regulations. So most of our eye hospitals are registered under the Clinical Establishment Act, as per this act, we have to take or treat any emergency patient that comes to our unit or clinic. So we have to provide them emergency care, stabilize, and then transfer the patients. So this is a legal mandate as per the various NCI norms as well as the court verdicts. So the legal mandate, it is clear that it's our duty to attend to the injuries as well as emergency of the patients. And this has to be as per the requirement of the medical legal statutory requirement. And you all know medical legal case constitute emergency patients as well as trauma patients. So I just go through all this things since it's not needed for this particular instruction course. I'm moving otherwise. The next standard is about triage of patients. So before you initiate appropriate care, you also have to do a proper triage, see what type of emergency situation, whether we can handle it or not. If we can handle, initiate the emergency measure and then try to transfer. So you have to do a simple triage and advanced triage based on the existing triage guidelines and as per the NABH standards also. And then the transfer part. So we have to have MOU or some linkage with the ambulance services so that the ambulance has access and space inside the organization. It has to adhere to the Motor Vehicle Act because ambulance have different kind of licenses. Ambulances should be appropriately equipped and manned by trained personnel. And ambulance has to be checked on a daily basis for emergency drugs. If you have a MOU, see to that the organization check this on a daily basis. And if you are using the emergency medication, that has to be properly replenished immediately. Then CPR guidelines, Dr. Sunita has covered that. I will not go into the details. And whatever CPR activity you do, that has to be recorded and then has to be analyzed later on. And also we have to initiate corrective and preventive measures based on the post-event analysis. And even during the procedure, some patients can turn into emergency patients, both ophthalmic as well as non-ophthalmic. So you need to have qualified personnel to perform and assist the procedures. And there has to be documented process to take care of wrong site, wrong drug, wrong patient, etc. And care of patient in ICU, of course, many of our units may not have intensive care unit or high dependency unit. But if you are having a recovery unit for pediatric ophthalmic patients or other ophthalmic surgery patients, so you need to have adequate team to take care of this. And with reference to medication, there are certain emergency medicines that we will be using. And these emergency medicines, you have to check the expiry date as well as see to that the look-alike and sound-alike medications are taken care of. With reference to the PRE, patient rights and education during the emergency phase, you have to get consent from the family members and also communicate with them about the status of the patient. And also you have to communicate to them about the cost that can happen during the emergency process. And then infection control mechanism, particularly post-operative patients. And during this COVID season, you have to take care of the infection control mechanism, even in the emergency situations, and see to that all this process are all documented. So you need to have a structured quality system in place for emergency management. And of course, licenses are mandatory and risk assessment has to be part of your NABH process. And you also need to have proper facility to take care of the emergency patients and non-fire emergencies. And you need to have medical gas and oxygenation and of course, train the staff on codes, various codes, and has to do a appraisal and also need to take care of the health needs of the staff. So basically NABH standard focus on this structure, process, outcome. So if we have good structure and process, even during emergency, we can have good outcome. And it's important, very important that you have a proper team in place for enforcing these standards to get good outcomes. Thank you so much for your kind attention. So any questions? Okay, so we'll move on to the next topic. So this will be by Dr. Kumaran Murugesan. I've already introduced him as a consultant at Kumaran Eye Specialty Center. So he'll be talking to us about his experience in managing an emergency situation in his daycare unit and some of the case scenarios. Over to you, Kumar.
Okay, good afternoon, sir. Good afternoon to all and a warm welcome. At the outset, I'd like to thank Dr. Nirmal and AOS for this opportunity. So my talk for the day is about my experience in managing an emergency situation the first time. Okay, so ophthalmology is one of the fields where we deal with a number of geriatric patients, both in your theater as well as in the OPD. So unfortunately, as an ophthalmologist, we do not deal with medical emergencies on a daily basis. Hence, we are not actually well versed with them. And also our staff whom we train sometimes are also not as equipped to deal with these medical emergencies, and there's a panic all around. As you would see in India, most of the ophthalmic centers are a daycare facility, which is usually run by a single or a couple of doctors. One doctor is in the theater and the other doctor is in the OPD. And in a case of a code blue situation, sometimes the staff are also not equipped to deal with them. For a simple reason is that they are not equipped or because they're not trained. So being this as a background, I'm going to share to you my experience of how I managed a code blue the first time when it occurred. To give you an overview, I started my practice in 2006. In those days, I never used to have an anesthetist standby during my surgeries, and fortunately, I didn't have any problem at all. Then we upgraded our facility, and we didn't have any problem for a couple of years. Then this is what happened for the first time. So this was a 64-year-old female who was posted for a second eye surgery. The first eye surgery went 1 week prior without any problem. So she reports to us for the second eye surgery, the reception. We normally check a blood pressure when she checks in. We also see whether she has taken all the medications, whether she has dilated the drops, and she was shifted to the theater. And everything was done. Our anesthetist also came and had a look. Everything was normal. Then she wanted to use the restroom because she was a third or fourth in line. And she came out of the restroom and suddenly she became breathless and she fainted. So this is what is the scenario which has happened. And then we had to activate the code blue immediately. And we were lucky because it happened just outside the theater. So we really didn't know what went wrong. So we went back to really assess this patient on what happened to him. So this was a patient who presented to us on an evening OPD. The patient had come from Kanjipuram. She had a systemic history of hypertension, and she had a bilateral cataract, and we went ahead and did all the investigations as far as the ocular is concerned. We also did the basic blood investigations, like ECG. We did take a consent. We did look into it all superficial, and we found everything was normal. The first eye surgery was very uneventful. Everything went on fine. She presented to us on the post-operative day. Everything went well. So going by this, we went ahead and fixed her for the second eye surgery. And before that, I already told you, and she fainted just before she went into the theater. So code blue was activated. She was shifted in the OT. By that time, I decided to always operate only with the anesthetist. See, auscultation revealed rales and bronchi. Her BP was high. Her oxygen saturation started dropping. So we started her on an IV line, injection Lasix and nitroglycerin. And we did have an ambulance, a protocol, and the ambulance was called and it arrived within 5 to 6 minutes, and we shifted the theater. So the theater anesthetist notes indicates all this which I've said now. Reviewed the patient was received in the ICU. I myself accompanied the patient. It was a multi-specialty hospital located around 500 meters from my block. Artificial ventilation started, all the patient's vitals stabilized. The cardiology was informed, and we stabilized the patient and we came out. But unfortunately, within a couple of hours, the patient vitals started dropping, and it was very unfortunate we couldn't revive the patient back. So what really went wrong? So we went back and we saw what were the things which we could have done better or what we missed. So initially, it was an obese patient. We didn't look into her medications seriously. We just did a superficial checkup. We found that all her initial investigations were normal. And adding ice to the cake, the first eye was very uneventful and things went better. So initially, during when the code blue was activated, we did have a problem to decide whether it was status asthmaticus or an acute MI. We had difficulty in finding an IV line because at those days, we didn't give an IV line to all our patients. There was panic all around because the first time we were facing a code blue situations. And the other difficulty is that we had difficulty in shifting an obese patient on the stretcher because we didn't have adequate staff. So unfortunately, when we went back to see what had happened, our CCTV camera in that particular floor didn't function, and we were not able to record the events. And the emergency notes has to be in place and follow up. So these were the deficiencies we had. So whenever you see a patient, we have to have a high degree of suspicion, follow the protocols, always have a IV line in place, or whatever kind of surgery it is, whether even if it's a cataract surgery, always have an IV line in place, check all your emergency medicines and all the instruments in your OT before you start any cataract surgery. Assign a separate staff for this. In fact, for an emergency team should have 6 personnel, and 1 person should always be recording all the events. And the take-home message which I got is always have another physician or an anesthetist to monitor your patient, however small your surgery may be. So these are the other common scenarios we usually come across at our place. This was a 50-year-old gentleman waiting in the OPD. He was a controlled diabetic, coronary artery disease, and a renal disorder. Suddenly becomes agitated and he falls down. So what do we do? So we normally go ahead, check the air, breathing, the vitals, the blood sugar, and his capillary blood sugar came at 62 milligrams. Sometimes we find that it's very important to get your glucometer calibrated, because we find that these strips are usually out of date, they expire, and they normally don't give a proper reading. And calibrating your instrument is very important, which has to be done very frequently as per the manufacturer guidelines. So hypoglycemia management is very common, and all of us have to be aware of what needs to be done. So treating hypos, I'm not sure whether glucagon is easily available in most of our hospitals, but simply you can go ahead by pushing in a bolus of 25 grams of glucose. The other problem which we commonly face, the cause, is a 34-year-old gentleman presenting to us with 4 seizures in the past. So seizure management is also very important. Check the vitals, make sure that the patient does not bite on himself. Positioning the patient and making himself comfortable, removing screws, is one of the important factors to be considered. So identifying the problem is very important, and making him safe during a fall is also crucial. So acute management of seizures is first that you make him comfortable, loosen the dressing, turn him to one side, look for the ID, and as the seizure ends, make sure that you've done everything rightly. You can make the patient lie down in the lateral position, give him oxygen or pump in lorazepam. And if still the seizures are continuing, you can just load an IV phenytoin and then call for help. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Kumaran. And that was so well on time. And so thanks for highlighting that such emergencies do happen, and you can have both negative as well as positive outcomes. What was the reaction from the attenders and the families when you encountered this patient?
The good thing for me was that the patient didn't collapse inside the theater because the attenders were not allowed inside. She wanted to go to the restroom and she came out of the restroom. We don't have a restroom inside an OT complex. They're just adjacent to the theater. So she went out, she went into the restroom and came out, and she collapsed in front of her attenders. So the attender was able to see what we were doing, and we took the attender inside also. So the attender saw what was happening. The ambulance arrived in time. So because of that, the son was able to accept it. And he also thought that we have done enough to save her. So in that way, we were saved, I could say, but it's very unfortunate that we couldn't save the patient. She actually had a ventricular rupture, which caused her demise.
Yeah, so it could have happened anywhere, but unfortunately for that day, it happened in your place. So what other measures you have other than having the ambulance support and certain systems in place?
So now, now we have we have 2 CPR teams, one in the morning and one in the evening, and we give regular training to them. We always check whether all our emergency kits are in place before we do the surgery. And we start an IV line even for our cataract patients, and I don't operate without an anesthetist, because for this particular patient, I was operating the previous case, and the anesthetist is who took care of them. And I really didn't know what had happened till I finished the surgery. So your oxygen and all the emergencies, what Dr. Sunita and others have highlighted has to be in place. And recording the events is also quite important, sir, because that stands in the court of law.
Yeah, definitely. Having a CCTV monitoring, recording, and so fortunately for you, the family was there. They were seeing the entire process, and they didn't made any ruckus or any issues. But that's not the scenario all the time. Particularly if there is a on-table issue, on-table death, or the attendants were not there after the event, so they come, they gather, and then becomes a mob violence or some sort of issues to the practice as well as to the staff. And that is one of the reason in emergency situation, the attacks on doctors, or attacks on staff and hospitals are more. So the last talk for this instruction course is on how medical emergencies can lead to hospital emergencies and crisis, and how we can manage with the help of our professional colleagues. As you all know, the golden hour in MI is the first 1 hour. So you have to identify the cause. You have, the bystanders have to initiate CPR, and then give first aid to the patient, then transfer to the nearby healthcare facility. The same way in road traffic accidents, you have a golden hour concept: stop the bleeding and assess the patient, immobilize, and then transfer the patient as soon as possible after giving first aid in the spot or in the ambulance. The same way, there is a golden hour for attacks or on hospitals, staff, and our buildings. And this is the lesson that is important in the concept of increasing number of attacks on healthcare facilities. And as you all know, eye hospitals are very small and do not have the protective nature like corporate hospitals or government facilities. So this is a pressure cooker situation. The concerned doctor, usually a single doctor, is in a state of shock, and there is a bias reporting by the family members to the press, to the police, and to the politician in the nearby area. So there's always a pressure from the police to settle the issue, or as soon as possible try to pacify the attenders. And there will be political splinter groups pressing for compensation, and relatives and mob, they have their own self-interest groups. So from one situation, a physician as God, or treated to the level of God and treated as one in the family, and consultant for various non-medical issues as well as medical issues. And now we are in this situation, protesting for saving ourselves and our practice. And we are blamed for every disaster, and there is attack on self or hospitals, and there is a constant damage to our image and brand image in the society. So crisis in non-ophthalmic emergency situation can go out of hand. This may be structure-induced, process-induced, doctor-induced, staff-induced, the drug or medicine-induced. It can be self-inflicted or inflicted by the patient or family. So how do we take care of this? So we have to understand the issues related to the various factors. So if it's a doctor-induced, never take over and above your capacity. If you have a capacity to treat only ophthalmic emergencies or ophthalmic patients, please display that in your scope of services, and see to that you have certain infrastructure for meeting these emergency patients. And even if it's not your specialty, it is your duty to take care of your patients in the emergency situations, and ensure that there is no errors with reference to counseling. Particularly, most of our counseling are done by the trained counselors, and somehow they give over and above counseling, and promise that 100% results or over promise. And also, most of the patients are not getting a proper informed consent. So you have to know your limit, discuss the issues with the patients, and see to that the patients are educated, counseled, and you get legally valid consent for yourself. And staff induced. So most of our staff have this capacity, tendency to spill the beans. So reveal the medical issues with reference to wrong site, wrong route, or wrong drug. And also they handle the patients in a rough manner, and particularly the attenders, and also give wrong news on the happening inside OT. So what happened in Kumaran's case was the patient attender was there in the scene. So there's no untoward accident. But in case of on-table death or on-table issues, the information given by our staff that actually aggravates the situation. And complications of local anesthesia. Some complication can happen even with local anesthesia or even during topical or infiltration. So you have to be aware of this. So you have to explain to the attenders, you can't just say it's only a topical or local anesthesia, but you have to ensure that the attenders know that even in infiltration anesthesia, some sympathetic or vasovagal attacks episodes can happen. It can lead to certain anaphylactic symptoms, or you can also have Lassa drug induced issues. So you have to inform the patients as well as the attender about the drug induced issues. So life is not about how hard of a hit you can give. It's about how many you can take also. This is very, very important from the standpoint of managing a medical crisis and the emergency situation. So you have to face the crisis as well as learn the lessons and try to prevent the crisis. So in risk management, you have to mitigate and prevent the crisis, be prepared for the next crisis, and also look for early warning signs for the disaster. And post-disaster or post-crisis, you have to see what was the response given by our team or the hospital and how we recovered from it. And you have to understand the lessons from the crisis and be ready for the next lesson or next crisis. So resilience is very important, and in involvement of the team and community is very important. There is a huge gap between about the structure and process we have and the outcome. And whenever a crisis happens, there is a huge counseling as well as communication crisis. And that's where these 4 Ps are important. The police can be helpful to us. The press sometimes can be helpful to us, but most of the time it invariably sensationalize the issues. The local politician can help to a certain extent, and public are not at all in support of the doctors. And politician, you all know, during the COVID crisis, there was a lot of flower show and all other things. But post or even during the COVID season, you know how they behave. So you have to liaison with these 4 Ps. That's very, very important in managing the crisis. Liaison with the police. Most often, the police tend to liaison more with the perpetrator of violence than the affected people. And so this is one situation. There was a death in the hospital. The mob demanded 304A section and then arrest of the doctor. And the local inspector insisted on filing a FIR on this section. So IMA protested and went up to the Director General and gave a memorandum to them. And later on liaison with the SP, it was the issue was solved, and a milder FIR was filed on section 174. Liaison with the press also helps. There was again an on-table death in one of the hospitals. The relative demanded immediate compensation, and the president and secretary of the local IMA branch explained to the press about the comorbid condition of the patient, as well as the high-risk anesthesia and high-risk surgery and the complicated process involved in the care delivery system. And the press people understood that and reacted favorably. And liaison with the politician also sometimes important, because very often these are the splinter group that derive power out of the political situation. And so we from IMA and senior leader reached out to the local ministers and explained the situation. With this intervention and the police intervention, the offenders were arrested, and that actually gave a mileage to the hospital as well as to the other hospital, that we can tackle any emergency situation when we are together. So public relations is very, very important, particularly when you are tackling non-ophthalmic medical emergencies. If you have a trained person, a public relation officer or a trained administrative officer who has the seniority as well as can coordinate with the 4 Ps, it's really would be good. And it's better be part of some social activity or NGO. Be courageous to face the situation, explain to the press what happened, and also coordinate with the IMA and other association to protect us during this time. And it's very important that we have a proper bonhomie with our professional colleagues. Very often an attack is triggered by a professional rivalry or some loose comment by a co-practitioner. So it's always better you have a cup of coffee or a good collaboration with your nearby professionals. So join associations, collaborate, and working together is very important when you are a practice owner. Process and protocols very important. If you have infrastructure and set systems and documentation, it's easy to escape out of any emergency situation. So the need of the hour is, apart from profession, you have to be an active entrepreneur, active association member, and take leadership in preventing emergencies, learning lessons out of emergencies, putting them into practice, and have a peaceful practice. Thank you so much. Problems are not stop signs, they are guidelines. I hope this deliberation and the talks will help you to improve your practice and also have a peaceful practice in your professional life. Thank you so much. So any questions from the audience or from the panels? We'll take. Yes, Atik. Raj, do we have time?
Yes, sir, we have.
Okay, so a couple of questions to the panelists. And Dr. Sunita, you listed out a list of equipment needed. So how cost effective would be this for small eye centers? Because many of our practices are single practitioner setup or just have one OT and OPD area. So what are the essential equipment and what would be the costing structure?
The crash cart we have to have in OT and in the investigation room. So that is kind of mandatory. We cannot skip that. Oxygen cylinder in the ward, in the and in the theater. So it's portable. So once the code blue is activated, once they start the CPR, the second nurse will be bringing in the equipment. They don't have to have it in every room. So one in the investigation room and one in the theater will do. You have to have the emergency medications in the each floor at least, in the OP investigation room and in the wards. So that has to be replenished. The routine, have the protocol, check for the expiry and make sure it's replenished. Other than that, a defibrillator, I think one will do. You don't have to have one in each place wherever it's just one in the OT will do, which we can shift as soon as the code was activated. The main thing is the training. So if everybody is aware of what they have to do at that particular point of time, then you can shift the equipment. You don't have to have each one at every point. So you can make it cost effective, provided you can concentrate more on the training and spend for that rather than on the equipment.
Okay, I think you asked about the frequency of CPR or the code blue training.
Yeah.
Generally, what we advise is during the induction training, you can train the staff. If they already have a BLS certificate or CPR training, then we have to give a additional training or revision training based on the feedback. So you have to check their knowledge about the BLS as well as the skills they have related to the CPR. And then if their skill is not up to mark, they have to undergo the BLS training again. Generally, 2 years is a validity for BLS certificate, and all healthcare professionals, particularly professionals working in the critical areas like ICU or operation theater, they have to be trained at least every 2 years. They should have a valid certificate. This is the accreditation norms. But generally, I would suggest all the in eye centers, most of the staff or non-nursing and non-medical staff. So I would suggest all of them to undergo a BLS training, and based on their knowledge, feedback, you can retrain them after 1 year. So what's your take, Kumaran?
Same thing, sir. We do it once in a year, and we call an external agency to teach us the BLS. And after 6 months, once we have an internal audit and we run a trial to make sure that everything is in place. And when you have multiple floors, sometimes it is difficult to shift because if the lift is not working or stairs. So I always have a crash cart in each floor with an oxygen cylinder. So because time is crucial, sometimes crucial time is lost in shifting or finding the oxygen. So what Madam showed, the crashed small boxes are very useful for us, and we have one in each place.
Okay, so it all depends on the size of the organization, and when you have a large organization, you can't have just one defibrillator. You need to, based on the size of the organization and the scope of services, you have to see to that you have a proper system in place, equipment in place. And as far as the training, we run a BLS training for healthcare professionals every year, every 6 months for other hospitals also. And so during the COVID time, you change that into an online program with hands-on practice later on. So we'll be starting one soon, another 1 or 2 months after the COVID second wave passes. So interested people can join us. So if there are any other questions, we'll take up. Otherwise, we have completed the talks as well as the discussion on time. And so with this, any questions?
What about the consents? We should have one for local as well as we should always get an emergency consent also, sir, for high risk cases. That will be shifting
yes.
you to a different hospital.
Yes. As far as the consent, our practice is we take a general consent when the patient enters our hospital. So that is a general medical consent for examination, as well as in case there is an emergency situation to attend to that. So we also take a high risk consent for patients with diabetes, hypertension, ischemic heart disease, and any other comorbid condition like asthma. We take a high risk consent. The third part is procedure related consent. If it is a cataract surgery or FFA or intravitreal, so it's procedure related consent. And if the situation warrants, so when there is a high risk, you might be using some resuscitation in that case. So we take additional consent or written consent from the attenders. So that is written and documented in the case record itself. Or we have CCTV in almost every area of the hospital. So that recording also can be used as a videograph consent. And some of the high risk consent we do record with the, after telling the patients and attenders that we are recording the consent and we are storing that. So this is for high risk cases, not for all the regular cases.
Any special consent with regards to COVID, sir, when you're taking up a patient?
Yes, in the initial phase, we were taking, even now we continue to take COVID consent that they can be asymptomatic carrier or is in asymptomatic stage. We also take consent from our staff that they can get infection from patients or the other places. So this habit continues. We still continue the last 1.5 years. We are continuing with special COVID consent from the patients. So this is a consent along with the questionnaire about the triage questions, what the government task force has given, a list of triage questions about travel, history of COVID in their families, recent contact, and then any symptoms with reference.
Kumaran is asking about pre-op consent, no, for COVID patients. Is that what you're asking, Kumaran?
No. This is about
Sorry to interrupt.
what
sir,
I
we
asked
have
for
1.5
general high
minutes
risk
left.
consent.
Yeah.
Sorry to
COVID
interrupt. We have
situation.
just 1.5 minutes left.
Okay, so we are through. So it's a COVID specific consent we take from all patients as well as staff. For the staff, we take
All patients are getting it.
Yes.
Anybody who
Okay.
enters, no, in the OP itself we get it. So that covers everything.
So that's it. So thank you all. I thank all the speakers for joining me in this program. And so this is one of a special instruction course which are not regularly covered in the academic part, but it's very important that eye hospitals and doctors take and plan for the emergency situation and take measures to adequately equip as well as have enough medications and train our staff to face the medical emergencies. So with proper preparation, we can tackle any medical emergency and give good outcomes to our patients. So thank you, AOS and the scientific team for this opportunity to conduct our instruction course. And thank you all the viewers for joining us for this instruction course. So any feedback, please write to us. Please feel free to contact me. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir. Thanks a
sir.
lot. Thank you everyone for such an informative session. By this, we conclude this hall for today. Thank you all. Stay
Thank
safe.
you, Gagan.
Thank you so much.
And finally,
Just smile and we'll take a group photo. Right. Thank you.
thank you for covering
Thank
up.
you so
sir.
much, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.